Welcome to today's episode of Locked On Women's Basketball. Today we are talking about women's basketball in the media, specifically TV shows and movies. And I'm joined by Jackie Powell, where we'll get into the past, present, and future of the WNBA in television, especially with Chiney Ogwumike's new show being announced the other day. This is Locked On Women's Basketball, brought to you by FanDuel.
You are Locked On Women's Basketball, your daily podcast on women's basketball. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to a new episode of Locked On Women's Basketball. I'm Chelsea Leite and I'm joined by Jackie Powell. It's an all the next episode of Locked On today, and we're talking about something a little different. We're going to talk about women's basketball and women's sports in movies and television. This is all coming off of the announcement earlier this week that Chiney Ogwumike and her production company are coming up with a new women's basketball WNBA centered sitcom that's going to be scripted, and they're teaming up with Peacock. So no news on when it's coming out. It still seems like it's in the very early stages. But Jackie and I immediately said, we got to hop on a podcast and talk about this. We're both big pop culture TV people. I didn't go to school for journalism. I went to school for TV writing. So this is my thing. And it's funny because when I talk about my past with people and they're like, oh, journalism school, I'm like, no, I went to TV school. We spend a whole day every week watching TV. So this is the exact perfect amalgamation of my interests. So I'm excited to talk to you, Jackie, about it. We're going to get to Chiney's show a little bit later, but we're going to start the conversation and just talk about the fact that sports, movies, and television are just so big when it comes to media. It's a genre that is never, ever going to get old. And you can just kind of run the gambit over and over, especially because sports culture changes so much over time, and especially women's sports culture, which we both know very well. So I'll start with just asking you, what are the sports movies that really got you, either now growing up in, the early 2000s was a big one for women's sports and sports movies in general. And I have my list, but let's start and talk about what your big ones are.
Well, first of all, Chelsea, it is an honor to be on with you. And I am so excited to really nerd out and get into the weeds of this. I've been waiting for someone in the women's basketball space who I could just go back and forth on this topic with. So it is such a pleasure to be here. So to answer your question, for me, the sports movies that I've loved, A League of Their Own, the film with Gina Davis and Tom Hanks, Madonna, Rosie O'Donnell, that is a classic. I think the first time I saw it, I was sort of well, wait a minute, I don't know. Is this really a feminist movie? And then I had to sit back and say, well, wait a minute, when was this movie made? Yeah. And so that was what really stood out to me there. A League of Their Own was so ahead of its time. Obviously, the television show, which was made on Amazon Prime, was canceled prematurely.
Soon.
I happen to think that if that was made in 2024, I think we'd be having a completely different conversation about it.
Yeah.
Just a thought.
Yeah, I agree. That show, it makes me almost angry to talk about A League of Their Own, the TV show, because it was so good and it was so well written and such not only an homage to the movie, but also just such a great representation of where we are in women's sports, where we were in women's sports, and how things are similar but different. It was, and I'm a huge Abby Jacobs fan, just in general, Broad City, all of that. And so to see that representation on the screen and have it be so authentic and real and just good, I was devastated to see it get canceled.
What I loved about Pitch, and to be quite honest, what I love about sports film and television shows, and why I think the ones that are successful really strike a chord, is because there's a really good balance of excellent character development and how the sports intersect with that. I think you always see a really intersectional piece of media whenever sports are in television or film. I mean, I know there's pushback when it comes to talking about sport and society, but it is sort of unavoidable in television and movies. And so, I mean, Pitch was a show that really spoke about those intersections in a meaningful way, in a realistic way. There were some moments that I think were a little bit cheesy and unrealistic, but I think what one of its strengths was portraying the pressure that a trailblazing woman in sports has to deal with. And so what I think about when I think about Pitch is, you know, you have the rise of these very famous WNBA players and women's college basketball players, namely Angel Reese, Caitlin Clark, Paige Beckers, Juju Watkins. I see some of Ginny Baker, that was the character in Pitch. I sort of make a connection between that group of women's basketball players and Ginny.
Yes. I love what you were saying about the like crossroads and the intersectionality, because I feel like sports is one of the best ways to bring like culture, politics, you know, movements into media, because one, it's something that like a lot of people can relate to. It's very rare to know someone who wasn't at least on like a one little sports team or was a part of a team in general growing up. And then, you know, I always think to my friend and mentor, Shireen Ahmed, who always says, you know, sports and politics, like you can't have one without the other. And it's so true. Like sports, and especially women's sports, are so inherently political, especially when you think about the fact that it's about women's, you know, rights, advocacy, about their bodies, about what they're choosing to do with their lives and their bodies and all of that. And, you know, even thinking back to like She's the Man, which is another one like that is on the top of my list.
Oh, and yes.
It's such a good one. A Shakespeare adaptation, which again, English major heart makes me happy. And then you think about the fact that it's like this soccer, like cross-dressing, like it has so many things that were so ahead of its time, talking about like sexism and, you know, trying to make it in like a man's business and being, you know, absolutely just like underestimated just because of the fact that you're a girl. And again, like stuff like that. And it makes me think of what movies, like another one on my list is Bend It Like Beckham. And like, oh, I love that movie. But at the same time, I'm like, there's so much about that movie that I would change low key.
Yes.
Yes. Like, those two main characters should be in love with each other, not in love with other people. What are we doing here? So yeah, just like things where I'm like, you can see again, like the past, then you can see the like evolution with She's the Man. And then now we're ready for more evolution. I mean, things like A League of Their Own are doing that, but like, we just need more. Like the women's sports movement needs to be making its way into media, because like, again, it's the best way that we propel like art and messaging and politics and all that stuff is through media. I think about even like Ted Lasso is now coming out with a show that is going to be based on a women's sports team, which is funny thinking about the fact that like Jason Sudeikis has been like a big WNBA person, women's sports advocate for a few years, and how originally Ted Lasso, they had said this is a 3-season arc. We have a 3-season story in mind. And, you know, it's very rare that you go back and tap into that after. And so I'm curious on your thoughts about the Ted Lasso, especially with Jason Sudeikis. I mean, you cover the New York Liberty, so you're around that and you know that he's been around. So like, what do you think about that?
I mean, I think you just started talking about how I feel about it, which is essentially Jason Sudeikis is putting himself in a situation where he can create more representation. And his presence at New York Liberty games, Indiana Fever games, at the NCAA tournament, March Madness, you know, I know there are women's sports fans that are tired of him, but to be quite honest, his presence is so important, because if they see him enjoying this and, you know, a big part of the community, it's going to get others to be interested in it. Ted Lasso, I mean, this show has won so many Emmys, such a popular show.
Yeah.
Not just in the United States, but around the world.
Sure.
So the fact that the lead of that show has put himself in the women's sports world, it is essentially inviting people to dip their toe as well. And so I think season 4 of Ted Lasso sort of represents this idea that representation matters and people with power. Jason Sudeikis is someone who has power in the media space.
Yeah.
He is, a straight white man. And in a lot of situations, what allyship is when you have people that are uplifting stories that are not about you. And so that's really what I think about Ted Lasso having a women's sports season 4. I'm assuming it's going to be a women's soccer team, but I mean,
I wouldn't be mad if it was basketball. Ted Lasso coaches the New York Liberty. Let's go. Bye, Sandy. No, I'm kidding. I love you, Sandy. Oh, man. Too good. But yeah, it's definitely exciting. So let's take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to talk about specifically the WNBA and women's basketball and, this rush now of media that we're seeing around it, but specifically Chiney Ogwumike's new show. So stick around. This is Locked On Women's Basketball. Scaling your business requires the right expertise at the right time. With Upwork, you can find specialized freelancers in marketing, development, design, and more. Experts ready to help you take your business to the next level. Upwork gives businesses flexibility by connecting them with top freelance talent across multiple industries, including IT, AI, web development, and marketing. Whether you need extra hands for a project or a long-term partner, Upwork makes hiring simple and affordable. Finding the right talent is hard when you need to come up with a marketing campaign. Upwork can connect you with a freelance expert who delivers incredible results. Visit Upwork.com right now and post your job for free. That's UPWORK.com, Upwork.com, to connect with top talent and grow your business today. March Madness is here, and FanDuel is giving you the chance to get in on the action like never before. Right now, new customers can get $200 in bonus bets when you with your first $5 bet wins. That's $200 extra bucks to use on everything buzzer beaters to Cinderella stories, and even who's cutting down the nets. I've got my eye on a few underdogs this year, and FanDuel makes it easy to back them with spreads, totals, and game props. So visit FanDuel.com to get in on the college hoops action all tournament long. All right, we are back here with Jackie Powell. We're talking women's sports and sports in television and media, and we are going to talk about women's basketball specifically now. And this comes on the heels of Chiney Ogwumike's announcement that she is creating a new WNBA-centered show with Peacock. It's going to be scripted, comedy, sitcom. And I think the first thing I want to talk to before we really just dive into Chiney and all of her stuff that she's doing is, like, first of all, I think there's a big difference between a sports movie and a specifically women's sports movie or television show. And I'm curious what you think, what needs to go specifically into a women's sports media as opposed to like a men one's. Like, how do you make it authentic?
I mean, I think it's about leaning into the intersectionality even more than maybe in a show about, male athletes or men in sports. Mm-hmm. And so, part of why the women's sports movement and the women's basketball movement has caught on in the way that it has is because there has been a pretty intentional strategy of, okay, we're not just attracting basketball fans. We are attracting young people that care about the world and that care about equality and that care about pay equity, social justice, rights for queer people, Black Lives Matter. I mean, the list goes on and on. And so having storylines that reflect those intersections with women's basketball, and to be quite honest, I mean, they're interest points when it comes to women's basketball. I think that has to be a prime focus. And so it was very welcoming to see that Chiney and her agent, Allison Gaylor of Disrupt the Game, are working on this with Liz Flahive and Carly Mensch. And those two, they created the very intersectional feminist show Glow, which was all about the women's wrestling troupe, or a women's wrestling troupe in the 1980s. And so while we know, or the limited information we know about Chiney's show is that the lead is going to be based on, or the leads are going to be based on her relationship with her agent, Allison. And so while Chiney isn't a queer figure, it is the hope that the writers that are, working on this show, they make sure that queer storylines are told in a show about the WNBA.
Yeah, it would be, I feel like that is like the one way to get people to be like, this isn't accurate, is to like not include that at all. But yeah, I'm really excited. Like, the announcement came out earlier this week, and a lot of people were a little put back and a little like wary of it, which like makes sense. I mean, it's hard, especially when women's TV shows and media in general get like, obviously, like we all know, the short end of the stick a lot of the time, and especially when you think about things like A League of Their Own and other shows that are women-centered that have been canceled too soon. And I mean, a whole other podcast is about the state of the industry right now, which I could go into, but we won't get into that. But I think it's the right time for a women's basketball-centered sitcom. And two, I just think like this movement of women's basketball that we're seeing as a whole, like the Caitlin Clark, the boom of the WNBA, expansion, it would be amiss if that wasn't leading to stories and sitcoms and media like this. Like we're already seeing the boom of sports, like books, like fiction sports books. A lot of it is, and a lot of the sports stuff that we've seen in the past is like soccer or baseball or whatever. Like we just are lacking women's basketball content, fictional content in general. So what are your thoughts on that? Like amid all of this like news about this show?
That's a really interesting point. And I think something that we didn't mention in segment one is there's this new show that was developed and written by Mindy Kaling. It's called Running Point. And it has Kate Hudson in this Jeannie Buss type role where she becomes the president of the fictional LA Waves, which is essentially based on the LA Lakers. And the reason I bring this up is because in a show like that, you're able to see what women have to contend with in a very much male-dominated sports industry. And while there are some similarities in the women's sports world when it comes to just how the sports industry works and how there's a lot of drama and there can be a lot of controversy. I think it's really notable that there's going to be a show centered around women's basketball players. And there have not been many of these. And I think, you and I, Chelsea, were talking before we began recording sort of about the history of women's basketball movies and shows, and the list was very short. We talked about Double Teamed, which has become, yes, that is a Disney Channel original movie, deep cut.
2002.
Yes. It came out in the early aughts. I mean, it was a story based on the lives of two WNBA players at the beginning of the league, Heather and Heidi Burge, who went to the University of Virginia. I believe they played with John Staley, if I have that correct. And so, I remember obviously when Carly Samuelson and Katie Lou Samuelson were both about to play for the Dallas Wings all of those years ago. the Dallas social team was making like double teamed social posts. So you have that movie, which wasn't like a great film, but for what it was very enjoyable. I have many feminist critiques of it now because this was made in 2003.
Yeah.
So you have that. You also have, let's think about what else. Big Shot, which was a show that aired, I want to say in 2022 or 2023.
Early 2020s.
And it was about a high school girls basketball team and their coach, but it mostly centered around their coach, who was played by John Stamos.
Mm-hmm.
It really was about how he, because of his temper and his anger, he was kicked out or fired from being a men's college basketball coach at a very prestigious program. And so the only job he could get was at a girls' high school team in California, I think in like La Jolla. And so even in my description of that, it sort of makes women's basketball, again, look like more of an afterthought or a, the
option. Yeah, the punishment. Yeah, that's a big one.
So, and to me, I was like, really? We're doing this? We're really doing this?
Yeah.
And it was interesting because there were some interviews. I think Kelsey Plum did some like cross-promotional type bits with Disney Plus in promotion of this show.
Wow. I didn't know
and
that.
I would love to ask KP about how that was, because again, it wasn't the most feminist show. And I ended up enjoying season 1. I thought there were some compelling storylines of some of the young women on this team, especially when it came to college admissions. And there was the star players' parents, they were involved in some fraud, and they became broke, and there were all these interesting stories. But it's like, why can't this be centered around the women's sports athletes? The women's athletes. It
was like the potential was there, but again, it wasn't focused like we were saying before. It needs to be focused on the intersectionality and the diversity of the players. And it was really something that was like male gaze focused on him and his failures and all the adults in the situation, and just more on like catchy storylines that were going on at the time. That obviously came after the whole like college sports fraud thingy with all those parents and whatever. And so, yeah, I think, like I said, there's like really nothing to go on when it comes to authentic women's basketball shows. And when you think about it too, like a lot of the media that we see around sports, it's about soccer, it's about baseball. It's a lot of, and I mean, Bend It Like Beckham's kind of the one here that maybe is the least like this, but it's a lot of like white centered stories about, sports that are predominantly white, or the people who are making them are predominantly white, and therefore that like goes into the show. And I mean, Ted Lasso did a great job of showing, some of those more diverse stories. And but I think a big point about why we haven't had like a women's basketball centered show is because a lot of people in TV, I mean, I worked in TV for a couple of years on set, and it's not a very diverse place. It's very male dominated. It's very white. And so having someone who, one, has played in the WNBA, but is also a Black woman and is going to be kind of leading the show in the way that is authentic. And like you said, like, hopefully she'll be able to bring in that sort of like those other dynamics in the WNBA in terms of the queer representation and, other intersections like that. But, it's so great that women's athletes are not having these media platforms where they're able to influence stuff like this, because traditionally the people who make these decisions in television are white, male, not very diverse. And so, like, to me, that's kind of the biggest indicator of why we haven't seen much of these stories. And when we do see them, they're not very diverse and therefore not very authentic, because at the same time you have to focus on the things that make you unique. So
that's a good point. It was appealing to the male gaze. And so I think it's worth drawing a parallel to the early days of the WNBA, where you saw Diana Taurasi, Sue Bird, Dawn Staley, these players being ultra feminized in how they were presented to the media, the photo shoots they did. I mean, you go and look at what these photos look like and the outfits they wore. It wasn't very authentic to who these people were. They were trying to put on a show to try to appeal to a certain population. And back in, the late 90s, early thousands, there wasn't this strategy of trying to appeal to the intersectional fan like there is today. And so I think that's part of it too.
It's already a good step in the right direction. So we're going to take a quick break, and then we'll finish up on the other end. Stay tuned. This is Locked On Women's Basketball. Daylight savings snuck up on us again, and if you're feeling that lost hour of sleep, 5-Hour Energy has your back. The extra sunshine means more time for fun, but sometimes you need a little boost to power through. Whether you're staying up late watching NCAA tournament games, squeezing in a round of golf after work, or just trying to keep up with your busy day, 5-Hour Energy gives you that quick, refreshing pick-me-up whenever you need it. I've been staying up late watching all of the March basketball action, and 5-Hour Energy helps me keep up the next day. Head to 5hourenergy.com and find over 15 flavors to choose from, including watermelon, blue raspberry, and peach mango. You can even build your own 12-pack or 24-pack delivered right to your door. Need one now? Grab a 5-Hour Energy shot at your local grocery or convenience store. They're everywhere. Stock up today and stay energized.
The NCAA tournament is here, and so is the Bracket Breakdown.
Locked On Podcast Network and Amazon Fire TV channels are teaming up to deliver NCAA tournament coverage like never before. Watch studio shows featuring former players and Locked On's local experts as they guide you through every upset, buzzer beater, and bracket matchup.
Stream it all for free on Amazon Fire TV channel. Search Bracket Breakdown to see it all for free.
It's your team every day.
All right, we are back. This is Locked On Women's Basketball, Chelsea and Jackie. And we've been talking about women's TV shows, sports TV shows. And so I'm curious, Jackie, if you were to be, whatever TV show said or network said, here, you have a show, what would you make it about in the sports world?
That's a really good question. There was this show on Max. It was about this group of reporters following a presidential election. I'm trying to remember what it was called. It had Melissa Benoist, who was in Glee and in Supergirl, in it.
Have you ever seen the show Sports Night? Or I think that's what it's called.
I have started watching that. That's by the people who wrote The West Wing.
Yeah.
Yes. So it's called Girls on the Bus. That was the show. And it was, it got canceled after one season. I think it could have been written a bit better than it was. But the concept was really interesting because it showed how coverage of politics has evolved in 2025. And so you're probably thinking, Jackie, why are you talking about politics? I really think there's a huge story on the media side when it comes to coverage of women's sports and really trying to tell the story of how much of an uphill battle this has been and how people, and I'm included in this. I do this work because I believe it is such a public service, but that's what covering women's sports is. We are telling stories that if we did not work as hard as we did, most likely would not be told. And so, yes, journalists are supposed to be objective, but there is a public service element to this, just like there is public service journalism that is done, at major news organizations.
Yeah.
So I would love a show about the grassroots women's sports media infrastructure.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I remember, because I cover the Toronto Raptors, and I remember the first time I went and I sat in our press room at Scotiabank Arena, and I looked around and I was like, this could be a TV show. Like, I'm sitting here, I'm like, this like young 20-something-year-old woman surrounded by men, and just like, I'm like, this is a TV show. Like, I'm sitting here and like these like millionaire basketball players are coming in, and I'm like, haha, like, you got so many rebounds today, blah, 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 blah. And like, I'm just like, and still, I'm almost 3 years in now, and still every time I sit in that room, I'm like, this is wild. Like, this is stuff that people should be seeing on television. And I really do hope the thing with, just to quickly touch on Shanae's thing one last time, I really do hope that they kind of, weave in the media aspect a little bit. I know there's sometimes a little thing about like, athletes, media, us, being on different sides of the same coin, but like, and I mean, Shanae, girl, call me up. But I would love to see that aspect of the WNBA put into the show. So that's
an excellent point. And you're reminding me of a question that I have for Chiney and everyone who is working on this show, which is, what WNBA are they going to be portraying? And the reason what you said reminded me of this was because, as we know, the show is going to be based on when Chiney was drafted and chose Allison as her agent. So does that mean that story is happening at around the time Chiney was drafted, which was a little bit over 10 years ago? Or is this story going to be taking place in the modern WNBA, which is, I mean, it's almost a completely different league?
Yeah. Yeah. And that's a good question. I have so many thoughts on it just based on like knowing what it takes visually to show something like that. Like, to say, oh, we're in 2013 or 2014, whatever, and like trying to like visually show that, as opposed to like, do you make it even further? Like, there's so much, like, you could fabricate things to kind of drive your point home a little bit more, or you could just make it in the present and say, hey, we're here, but we still have so much farther to go, and that kind of be the message. But yeah, that's a very intriguing thought of like where it's going to be placed in the, the movement that we're in right now. But like we've been saying this whole time, you and I could go on and on and on about this. And maybe we will one day once we get more news about it or something. But for now, we're going to have to cap it there. Thank you so much, Jackie, for coming on. It's so fun to talk to you about stuff. And I mean, everybody can find Jackie's work on The Next. She covers the New York Liberty and the league as a whole, and does a fantastic job on it. So make sure to follow Jackie and The Next. And we'll see you next time for Locked On Women's Basketball. I'm Chelsea Leite. Make sure to subscribe, and we'll see you next time.